We now turn to the evolution of the IASC in the 1990s. By far its most productive period. And we see the competition between IAS, International Accounting Standards, and US GAAP. The FASB and the European Commission finally began to get interested in the work of the IASC and began attending IASC meetings as observers. When the SEC gets interested in something, the FASB gets interested in the same thing. And because of the SEC's interest, the FASB, with a chairman that was quite interested in international financial reporting, began to get involved in a rather proactive way with the IASC, as well as the European Commission, because there was a change in personnel. In 1990, the IASC began an improvements project, again at the behest of IASCO, to enhance the quality of 10 standards in particular, and it completed the project in 1993. We have to take into consideration that the IASC, being a part-time board, because its members came from all around the world, had full-time jobs, and nonetheless had a great deal of documentation to read. They had meetings to attend. They attended steering committees which helped draft standards, that it was quite an achievement that in only 2 or 3 years they take 10 technical standards and complete them, one hopes, to the satisfaction of IASCO. And when we talk about the satisfaction of IASCO, we mean the satisfaction of the Securities and Exchange Commission, because throughout the history of IASCO, the SEC has been the most powerful force in IASCO, and very little comes out of IASCO that has not been endorsed by the Securities and Exchange Commission, being the most respected securities market regulator throughout the world. 1994, IASCO accepts some of the enhanced standards and demands more improvements, plus a standard on financial instruments, which in the 1990s had become a very complicated issue, especially with all of the derivatives outstanding. The IASC and IASCO agree to a program to complete 24 core standards by 1999. And after that, it was hoped that IASCO would then endorse the IASC standards, which meant, of course, that there was a high degree of acceptance, or at least acknowledgement, by the Securities and Exchange Commission. This was much to be wished by the leadership of the International Accounting Standards Committee. In 1993-1994, a new sub-body was formed called G4+1. The four were the United States, the UK, Canada, and Australia, and in 1996, New Zealand came in. These were the standard setters, as opposed to the professional accounting bodies. And beginning in the 1980s, one by one, members of standard-setting bodies in some of the member bodies on the IASC began joining and participating, and especially in the 1990s. And so standard setters' interest became alive in the IASC, and they gradually became members. And there was a feeling among the Anglo-American standard setters in those 4 countries, joined by New Zealand in 1996, that they could make a much more effective presentation in meetings of the IASC if they could gather together among themselves with a common conceptual framework and common aims, financial reporting to investors and capital markets, and decide what their common position was. And they met together with the IASC Secretary General as an observer. And they held frequent meetings around the world. They issued a number of reports and studies. And there was some fear on the part of the IASC that this group, the G4+1, might become an international standard setter instead of the IASC. So there was a bit of a rivalry between those bodies, the G4+1, which was really an informal association of leading standard setters in the Anglo-American world, and the International Accounting Standards Committee itself. In 1996, the SEC finally goes public and enunciates 3 key elements, as it called them, required in the International Accounting Standards. High-quality standards were those with comparability, transparency, and full disclosure, values that the SEC always held in the highest regard. By 1996, the IASC board was composed of 16 delegations, not just 14, adding the Nordic Federation, Switzerland, financial executives, Korea, Jordan, India, and Malaysia. And the financial executives stayed until the end of the IASC. And so a greater diversification was occurring. More countries were participating, rotating on and rotating off membership from time to time. Also in 1996, the IASC accelerated its target to March 1998 for completing the core standards. It would be difficult enough to reach it by 1999, but they felt it had to be done earlier, 1998. What was the reason? Major developments were occurring in Europe. All of a sudden, on the continent, there was an increased interest in the need to report to capital markets and not just to pay attention to creditors, specifically banks. In 1993, Daimler-Benz, which was the largest corporation on the continent, became the first German company to list on the New York Stock Exchange and broke the wall of opposition. The German companies refused to associate with the New York Stock Exchange because they didn't want to have to reconcile their German GAAP results in their financial statements with U.S. GAAP. Ever since the early 1980s, the SEC had insisted that all foreign companies coming to trade in the United States, not using U.S. GAAP, but instead using, let us say, a national GAAP, had to reconcile their earnings and shareholders' equity to what would be obtained if they had used U.S. GAAP. This was a way of promoting sufficient comparability with U.S. GAAP. This was considered to be an onerous reconciliation. It was very time-consuming, and the reconciliation itself had to appear among the notes to the financial statements. And all the German companies, for a while, refused to engage in such an activity. Therefore, they did not want to list on the New York Stock Exchange. So in 1993, when Daimler-Benz broke ranks, other German multinationals began reassessing their position and began considering the use of either international accounting standards or U.S. GAAP, usually in their consolidated financial statements, because in their parent company financial statements, which in Europe had to be prepared and published as well as consolidated financial statements, in their parent company financial statements, they were required by law to use German GAAP. At the same time, German multinationals began to outgrow bank financing, and banks looked to other markets. What was happening? In 1990, German reunification occurred. West Germany and East Germany became Germany. And the government of Germany began urging the banks to do much more lending to companies in the former East German company in order to bring East Germany up to the economic level of West Germany. And furthermore, many of the banks in Germany were beginning to expand into investment banking, and therefore were not as disposed to be the house banks of the multinationals, always available to provide financing for their activities. As a result, the big German companies had to look to the capital market more than they had done before, and the need to report to the capital market consequently grew to become more important. And then in 1996, the recently privatized telephone company in Germany, Deutsche Telekom, held the largest initial public offering in European history, $13 billion US. And it turned out that some 2 million German households were among the purchasers. Nobody realized that there was a potential retail equity market in Germany. And that was another reason why the German Stock Exchange began to realize that there was a need to expand and to bring a lot more companies to market. And as a result, many German companies began to realize that if they issued shares of stock in the markets, there was this retail market that might purchase them. In 1997, the following year, the German stock exchange created the Neue Markt, that is to say, the new market for young, high technology companies. And one of the requirements was that you had to use IAS or US GAAP. And even though most of the companies that were listed on the new market were German, they could not use just German GAAP unless they reconciled German GAAP to US GAAP. They had to use IAS or US GAAP because those gaps were believed to be relevant to a capital market, whereas German GAAP was highly legalistic and narrow. And the European Commission, which as we know was long cool to the IAS, began to take IAS seriously as an option to the directives it had been issuing on accounting and consolidated financial statements. That was really all the European Commission was willing to do, but it began to get interested. Why? Because Germany, one of the most important countries in the European Economic Community, was becoming interested in reporting to capital markets. And so the European Commission turned its attention more to capital markets and less to issuing directives just to report to shareholders. The company law directives, therefore, were the option to reporting to securities markets. In 1998, the IASC completed the revision of its core standards according to plan. The final standard was on financial instruments, where the IASC essentially borrowed US GAAP, and they submitted their core standards to IASC for consideration. As I say, the final standard was IAS 39 on financial instruments. In 1997-99, a wrenching 2-year period, the IASC began restructuring its part-time board. By the 1990s, there were so many members, 16 members, 65, 70, 75 people sitting around an enormous table trying to deal with highly technical matters, all being part-time. It simply wasn't feasible. And the SEC and others said, going ahead, there has got to be a more effective way for setting standards. It can't be done on this part-time basis with an enormous number of people sitting around a gigantic table. And the question was, during the restructuring, is would the national accounting bodies, the national standard setters, the SEC, and the European Commission all accept whatever the result was? And the negotiations went on for 2 full years. After an IASC working party contemplated numerous alternative approaches, the SEC issued a letter that said that the restructured board to be possessed of authority and legitimacy must be small, full-time, have a large research staff, and its members chosen only for their technical expertise, very much like the FASB model. That's what the SEC insisted upon, as I say, for the IASC successor to possess authority and legitimacy. That meant that if you wanted to keep the SEC into the picture, and the SEC was willing to support the work of the successor body, you had to accept its dictate that the resulting standard setter after restructuring had to be very much like the FASB. Not all agreed. The European Commission said that it wanted a large part-time board with geographical representation, much more politically oriented, not concerned about technical expertise, not concerned about the size of the research staff. And finally, following a tense internal debate, the IASC approved a restructuring along the lines of the SEC's insistence. And the IASC approved the creation of a 19-member board of trustees for an IASC foundation, as it was called, and a nominating committee selected Paul Volcker, the former chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, as its first chairman. And so then the International Accounting Standards Committee ended its life in the year 2000, and we now look ahead at the development and the founding of its successor, the International Accounting Standards Board.